One of the most powerful barriers we have is this phrase, I need to figure it out. Some of us go months or even years saying, I need to figure it out. In fact, how many of us have an uncle or somebody, some distant relative of us who's been saying that for years? I'm going to write a book. I just need to figure it out. As I've written before, the most important step is getting started. I've written about this with my 85% solution, where it's better to get 85% of the way there and stop than to dream about 100%. So I always find it fascinating when we let those barriers of I need to figure it out control us. But on the other hand, you have to balance it. You can't just jump into something and get started without thinking about it, doing your research, doing your homework. So when I talk about this, a lot of times people say, how do you balance the two? I know I was confused. Sometimes I would spend months and months researching something and I would never get it off the ground. Other times I would jump way too impetuously into something and never really do my homework beforehand. So I started to think of different frameworks in order to use it. And I realized there is a way to balance these two. Here's what I do that's worked really well for me. So I will recognize that I need to do my homework. Let's say I'm going to create a new course in a totally different area. Okay? Now I could just jump in there and start building stuff. That might feel really good in the short term, but I probably won't get the best results. On the other hand, I could sit there and spend a year or 5 years doing research and not actually deliver anything. So what I do is I say, okay, based on my experience, how long do I need to do some basic research? For a lot of things, it's about 2 weeks. So let's say in this case, I'm going to do 2 weeks of research. And then I'm going to start. I'm going to start building. I'm going to write my first 10 pages, whatever it is that it takes. Notice how I'm balancing the two. I'm acknowledging the importance of research, but I'm setting a hard deadline, and then I'm moving on to the creation phase. Let me give you an example of where most people don't do this. Think about when it comes to investing. How many people do we know that say, yeah, I know I really should start investing. I need to figure it out. I need to get my ducks in a row. And 1 year goes by, 5 years go by, 15 years go by. And all the compounded interest they could have accumulated, all the knowledge they could have gained, gone. Because they didn't take the time to figure it out. That's their code word. But what they could have done was say, you know what? I'm going to spend 2 weeks researching this. And in fact, I'm going to get more specific. I'm going to spend 1 hour every other day for 2 weeks doing this. It's on my calendar. And at the end of that, on this date, I am opening up an investment account. Great. And then you go on to the execution phase. Instead, so many of us get paralyzed with all these things we could do that we never set a hard deadline for ourselves. And if it's important for us, like for many of us, investing is critically important. In fact, by the time we turn 40, money is one of, if not the most important thing we ever complain about. So what would the difference be on your life if you were able to say, look, for these important decisions, I'm going to give myself a little bit of time to digest and read and learn, but after that, I'm executing. It's funny. It makes me think about in Silicon Valley when I did a startup, the worst fear for Silicon Valley entrepreneurs is to start a company and it just trades sideways. In other words, it just kind of chugs along. It doesn't die. It just kind of goes along, limping along. They would obviously rather have this. They would rather have a smashing success. But surprisingly, most Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, their second choice is for it to go like this, right? Either succeed or fail fast. But the worst is for it to kind of limp along. And I think that's actually true of our lives as well. I'd rather have something wildly succeed. Don't get me wrong, I'd love that. But if it's not going to, I'd rather know. I'd rather figure that out. The principle I took away from that is let's be impatient with ourselves. Let's not give ourselves 3 years to research how investing works. We don't need to do that. Most of us do not need to become financial experts in order to invest. Let's give ourselves a limited amount of time. 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. We read a couple books. We talk to a few experienced people who we trust. And then we get started. The truth is, you will learn far more from doing it than from your initial research phase. That's why I want you to set a hard deadline and then move on to execution. You know, it's funny. A lot of these principles, when I first thought of them and I tried to write them down, they seemed so obvious. Oh, duh. Just first do your research and then execute. And I was talking to more and more friends. I remember one friend talked to me and she's doing a startup and she had a few hundred users, free users. And I said, cool, this is great. How will you know if it succeeds or not? And she said, oh, there's no choice. This is gonna succeed. And in my head, I was like, uh-oh. Because if you don't choose when to quit, your worst fear could be realized, which is that you kind of just limp along. So under my framework, I would have rather that she said, you know what? In 6 months, my goal is to have 10,000 free users. Okay, great. So she'd said in 6 months, she said a timeline, and she'd said a number of users, 10,000. Okay. Now, if it didn't work, let's say that she had 800 users by that time. Shut it down. It's obviously not working. And she would have had those milestones along the way to recognize that. But what if she got to 8,500 users? For me, that's a pretty good sign. She didn't get to 10,000, that's fine, but she's clearly getting closer and closer to that number. So to me, I would say, keep going, this is great, you're on the right track. But the worst is to work on something or dream about doing something for months and years and have no idea if it's a success or not. So here's my challenge for you today. Here's my action step for you. I want you to pick one thing that you've been thinking about doing forever. It could be starting a business, going on a trip, whatever. And I want you to say, how long is it going to take me to figure it out? You will never be the world's expert at this in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. Accept it. It's not going to happen. The good news is you don't need to be. Instead, how long will it take you to get the minimal amount of research done so you can actually start? That means if you're going on a vacation to Thailand, how long will it take you to look at prices, look at areas to go to, etc.? I argue you can do that in 2 weeks. For most of these things, you can do it in 2 weeks. And then, what is going to be your first step of execution? Write it down. So that's what I want to see from you today. What is your goal? How many weeks are you giving yourself to do the initial research? And then what is your first step of execution? This has been a very powerful framework for me to cut through these cobwebs, these overwhelmingly large projects, and say, okay, Ramit, I don't need to become the world's expert. Get me 85% of the way there. I can probably do that in 2 or 3 weeks, and then let's get started. I want the same for you. I'll look forward to seeing what you put down.